Hi, I'm Mindy with Hinley Handmade, and welcome to my new series, Design Diaries. I'm back with episode 2, Making It Work. My intention for this series is to give you a peek behind the scenes of what it takes to design, test, and release a new knitting pattern into the world. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy this, please tap the like button, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications by clicking the little bell so that you will be notified when I post a new episode. One last note before we get started. This is something new for me. So as I assembled the footage for this episode, I realized that there were things that I forgot to get video coverage of, so please forgive me. But if you do enjoy this, I'd love to try it again. So any suggestions you have for me, I would be grateful for, and I will also try my best to remember to record more things as I go through the process. Okay, let's get started. Last week, I shared my idea sparks, choosing yarn and a stitch pattern, and getting myself organized. We left off with me winding my yarn. The next step in the process is to cast on and begin swatching. Because I like top-down socks, when I am designing socks, I like to go ahead and knit the ribbing, insert a lifeline, and then test out the pattern. This feels like a bit of a swatching shortcut for me, and it usually works just fine. If my stitch pattern doesn't work, then I just rip back to my lifeline and begin again. Easy breezy. As I was very enthusiastic about knitting with this yarn, I flew through the ribbing, but noticed from the get-go that the yarn gauge just didn't seem quite right. I continued anyway because I wanted to test out my selected stitch pattern. And two things happened at this point. First, it was obvious that my scattered dots pattern was not going to work on this yarn. It wasn't visible enough. Second, the sock was turning out way too big, which is what I suspected was going to happen once I started the ribbing. At this point, I had to make some decisions. The questions I asked myself were, how badly do I want to use this yarn? If I do really want to stick with it, am I willing to adjust my cast-on stitch counts to fit properly? This would mean also adjusting the stitch counts for the other two sizes that I planned to include. And also, do I want to go back to the drawing board in terms of finding a stitch pattern that will work with this yarn? Alternatively, if I want to choose a different yarn, am I loving the stitch pattern enough to stick with it? Or do I want to explore more and try something else? Ultimately, I chose new yarn. And while I do like the stitch pattern, I decided I wanted to choose something more interesting. One fear I always have as a knitting pattern designer is accidentally designing something that already exists and unintentionally copying another designer's work. The scattered dots pattern felt basic enough that it could realistically happen in this case. I know there would be differences in the written pattern, but it is a fear of mine, especially as a newish designer. So I went back to my focus on texture and found a really great stitch pattern that was created simply with knits and purls alone. And that was exactly what I had originally set out to find. So I drew a quick chart of my new stitch pattern and cast on with my new yarn. This is my own Hinley Handmade yarn on Bachelor, which is my sock weight base, in the colorway Verdant Fields. It was from last fall's yarn collection. I had already wound it into two 50-gram cakes for a different project, but seeing as I couldn't remember why I'd done that, I decided these socks are what they'd turn into. Maybe I was planning to knit something doubled to create more of a DK weight yarn. I don't know, I can't remember. So I cast on with my new yarn and knit the cuff. Again, I inserted a lifeline and got to work testing this new stitch pattern, and I loved it. After I knit a few repeats of the chart, being sure to include a lifeline at the end of each repeat so that I could easily count them, I felt confident in both the yarn and the stitch pattern. This is where I pulled out my design diary again and started doing some figuring. Measuring my work, I decided on the number of chart repeats I'd include before moving on to the heel flap. As I continued to work through my socks, I made sure I took lots of notes. At this point in my sock knitting journey, I don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel, so I use pages from my previous sock patterns to make sure I have all the details of knitting the heel flap, the heel turn, and gusset in the way that I prefer. For this pattern, there were two things I wanted to play with in terms of improving upon my previous patterns. The first was playing with the length of the reinforced section under the heel. Years ago, I adopted knitting a reinforced sock sole, inspired by the way mini heel flaps are designed. I include this slip stitch sole as an option for all of my sock patterns, but you can learn how to do it in my free tutorial, Strong Steps, Reinforce Your Sock Soles with Slip Stitches. I'll be sure to include the link for that down below this video in the description box. The other part I wanted to try improving also related to the reinforced sole. I wanted to experiment with adding short rows on the sole to see if I could make them more comfortable by adjusting where the Kitchener seam landed. I'll get to that in a minute though. The first thing I came to while knitting the sock was playing with the reinforced heel length, as I just mentioned. As you may have heard me say before, knitting socks is part art, part science. There is a bit of experimentation required to figure out what fits your foot best. This was me doing just that. Usually, and if I'm being honest, this was for simplicity's sake, I stop reinforcing the heel once I've completed my gusset. This worked okay, but because I knit a longer heel flap, it means more gusset decreases and therefore a lengthier reinforced heel. And I just didn't feel like the whole thing was necessary. I tried on my sock a few times to see where I wanted that reinforcement to end and decided that I did, in fact, want it shorter than what I've called out in sock patterns in the past. This did create a small modification for the other sizes, so I made notes to make this modification when writing the pattern. At this point, I decided I'd better start the pattern writing process before I got too sucked into knitting my sock. The risk there is not taking enough notes and forgetting to include changes I've made from previous patterns, because I'm just going to grab a copy of my last sock pattern that I designed and use it as a base for writing this pattern. Again, why reinvent the wheel here? So I grab my last sock pattern and make a copy of it. Start updating. Because of the number of stitches in my stitch pattern, I needed to modify just the standard 64 stitch sock size. I call it size 2, by decreasing a stitch. When I did this while knitting my sock, I realized once I got to the heel flap that I'd need the back of the sock, the part to become the heel, to have 32 stitches for it to work nicely. So I shifted my stitches so that the instep now held 31 stitches and needle 2 had 32. This is also when I charted out the stitch pattern in a program called Stitch Mastery. I have a love-hate relationship with this knitting software program. I absolutely appreciate that it's available to me because I can easily chart any stitches I want with all the symbols that they offer. But it's a bit, or a lot, clunky and is not very intuitive to me. I've spent hours with this program and still struggle with it. But lately we've come to an agreement to play nice together, and you can see that overall charting today went quite well. It produces both charts and written instructions for me, so I export both and bring them into my pattern. As a side note, I do my pattern writing in canva.com. It's not my favorite, and someday I'll switch to something more designed for pattern writing, such as maybe Adobe InDesign. But for now, this is what I use. When I first took my design course, my knitting design course, I was given pattern templates for Canva, so I've stuck with it because that's what I've become familiar with. The written instructions, while Stitch Mastery pops them out for me, they still need improvements. I make sure they are updated to fit my particular instruction style and pop the chart and instructions into my pattern. I also run through the rest of the pattern, updating, or as much as I can, updating everything for this new pattern. I have to change stitch counts for the size 2 63 stitch sock, so I'm careful to check all those numbers. Every time I reuse a pattern like this, I'm always surprised at how much actually needs to be updated. I think, oh, this is going to be pretty quick this time. And it never is. It's amazing how much time it takes to run through the pattern with a fine-tooth comb to make sure everything now makes sense for the new stitch pattern and design. I do pause at the gusset though. I want to experiment knitting it with the modifications I talked about earlier to see how that changes the number of repeats for this particular section before making any changes to the pattern. So it's time to pick up my sock again. I go ahead and make the heel flap and heel turn, then pick up my gusset stitches as I typically do and continue to the decreasing of my gusset. And this is where I needed to pay attention again. I test out how deep into the sole I want the reinforced heel to go by trying it on and adding lifelines. When I'm happy with the length, I make notes and think through how it will apply to the other sizes, if at all. And I continue on in this way, bouncing from my knitting and lifelines and updating sections of the pattern so I don't get lost or confused about the modifications I made while knitting. And this I've learned through experience. And that's what I have for you this week. Next time I will share how adding in short rows went and what I do to finish up the pattern to send it to my tech editor. Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to help support what I do here at Henley Handmade. My channel isn't a big enough one to get paid for being here on YouTube. I don't make any money on it. I have it as a way to easily share information with you and to get my micro business out there into the world. So I truly, truly appreciate it when you respond to my videos because it does help my videos be seen by more knitters. And it's just especially helpful for a tiny channel like mine. Thanks again and see you next time.